Hello friends, my name is Martinez, and right at the very beginning of isolation I tweeted out like a joke about how much extra reading we were going to get done because of all of this extra time, but I didn't know at that moment that the joke was on me because reading for escapism. Who is she? I'm not a reading for escapism person, and I think that there are a couple of reasons why. It's not even that I can't get lost in fiction, but I am somebody who approaches my fiction feelings first. I always feel a little bit self-conscious when I say that because I go on and on and on this channel about how I am a critical reader, and I think that people assume that because I do break down what I read pretty closely most of the time that I can't also be like a messy emotional binge about my fiction. Maybe in general too, but we're talking about my fiction right now. What that means for me personally is that when my emotions are already taxed by other things, if I'm stressed or overwhelmed or anxious, I can't then approach fiction, and I can't then borrow the stress or anxiety of fiction. It feels honestly paralyzing to me to enter into kind of those unknown circumstances. I haven't done a wrap-up on this channel since the end of February, beginning of March, and it hasn't even been that I've been reading or watching nothing. It's just been so sporadic and very all over the place. I have been starting a lot of things, and I'll like tentatively enter and see if I can enjoy that piece of media, and then I abandon it if I can't. And so at the very beginning I was kind of talking about these things. Like I made a whole video about why I hate read, and I talked about reading Sarah J Maas's new book, or I was doing Goodreads updates and adding things on my currently reading shelf or whatnot, and then I was stepping out of them pretty quickly if it wasn't working for me. So it kind of left me in this weird space where I was constantly starting to talk about things but not really finishing, which is not fun for me and probably not fun for you either. To be clear, I'm okay with how I'm consuming media currently because it's working for me and it's bringing me comfort, and I'm like very in tune with like what feels right and what does not feel right, and I'm okay basically being like, no, you don't feel right, and moving on. So I'm taking care of myself. The only thing that bums me out a little bit is that this is not a good way to consume media if you also want to create content and talk to people about what you're consuming. So I'm always like bummed out that I don't have that portion of my normal media consumption routine kind of in play, but otherwise like I'm doing my best. Today, doing my best is taking the form of this video, basically telling you about the things that I have managed to read from March until now. First up, I've been consistently reading the books that we pick up for House Salt's book club. For those of you that don't know, House Salt is just me and my closest booktube friends. We decided at the beginning of this year to harness our powers of being salty about everything and very often disagreeing about books and put that into a live show. We pick a book every month and then we have a live show. It has been a ton of consistent fun during these uncertain times. In March, we read Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare, and so we pick books that we are generally interested in. We don't pick books to hate read them. Obviously, like we have to reach some sort of consensus. So there are people in our group who really enjoy Cassandra Clare, and I am not one of them, but I was okay reading this, primarily because I read City of Bones and that's it, and I really did not like City of Bones. I just found it like really cheaply written and cheap plot and just kind of very basic, and on top of that I thought that a lot of the characters were kind of insufferable, namely the main male. I think his name is Jace. He's a douchebag, complete and utter douchebag, and then Clare is like a terrible friend and kind of a terrible human being, to be honest. So I just didn't have a good reading experience with that, and then the ending, just thinking about it gets me worked up again. But I have a review up for that book on my channel. It's one that I think about redoing all the time because I'm not happy with the quality of it, but it is a way that people find my channel pretty consistently. But anyways, people leave comments on that video basically telling me that the series gets better and Claire's writing gets better as she matures as an author. So when House Salt was proposing Chain of Gold for the live show, I was like, okay, cool. This will be a chance for me to see for myself if that feels right to me that her writing has gotten better, her series has gotten better, and according to the publisher, or like what I had heard, you really didn't need the other books in the series in order to start this new series fresh. I will start by saying that I definitely didn't dislike this one as much as I disliked City of Bones. It did feel like better quality in general to me personally. The best part about it were some of the characters, particularly Cordelia, the main character, and so that whole thing about like not needing the context of the other books I think is a bunch of baloney. But at least when I was like drowning in family trees and like 87 million characters or whatever, I was like, oh, there's Cordelia, go girl go. And I had like an entry point and I was actually rooting for her and hoping for her success. Honestly, at this point I just feel like Clare is so deep into her world and her mythos that there isn't a way to come into these books without some context and enjoy them. I think that half of what she has built into this book to enjoy is callbacks to other characters and other plots and other situations. Her story gets so bogged down that the first 100 pages were absolutely tedious, and then it settles down into a fine story in the middle, and then the story ends, and for some reason the book keeps going for another 100 pages. So there's like 100 pages at the beginning and 100 at the end that just should not exist. During the live show, we talked a lot about like the appeal of this, of just being like beautiful young teens like on a romp and like pretty dresses in society and whatnot, and I totally get that, and I'm here for a good CW show vibe, like a CW teen show vibe in a book, but I don't think that this was that necessarily. Like there wasn't enough romance, there wasn't enough like of that society, or that stuff that was there wasn't particularly well written or well described. I don't think Clare has the capacity, or like her style is not overly descriptive and it's not good at descriptions. So if you wanted me to enjoy sort of these like settings and these set pieces, like I don't think she did that well enough to make up for the fact that it was entirely way too long, bogged down, and just honestly like a who's who of all of the people Clare has ever written about before. Just overall, like it was fine. It was meh. It was like mediocre writing in a story that was 100% built for and written for somebody who is not me to enjoy. I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. In April, we read The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. I had such a weird reading experience with this. It is an incredibly complex and layered story. It has a lot of moving parts and pieces, and I was not in the right headspace in April, I think, to read this particular book. So the experience itself, like there were points that I was really struggling through it, but then at the end and reflecting back on it and through the conversation, I really realized how much I admired the pieces of the story, how much I thought that it was well done. Like this is a very skillfully written and constructed story. So I was kind of like in this limbo place where I was like, I didn't necessarily enjoy all the pieces of reading that, but this is a really good book. So it is obviously already on my list of books that I would like to revisit and reread. I think in a place where I'm better able to pay more attention, and honestly on reread probably, now that I've got kind of the bones of the story, this will just kind of excel in my personal opinion. But as it was just a little bit of a mixed reading experience. As I said, this is very spiraling and it has a lot of different layers, and it takes a while for those pieces to kind of come into focus and for you to understand what is exactly happening. I've already decided that I'm not going to do plot synopses for these books. I always leave links in the description if you want to learn more, but even if I were, like I would not even know how to begin with a plot synopsis of The Glass Hotel. Like it is so absolutely wild, and it's got all of these plot pieces, but the thing that it really does is explore these big themes, and it is themes of wealth and growing up without, themes of personal connections, themes of, you know, the small daily ways that someone can con you, and then like this giant Ponzi scheme that kind of anchors the story overall. I really enjoyed Station 11 by the same author, but in that the sci-fi element was a lot stronger. Here the sci-fi fantasy element is sort of in the background, but I really loved what it said overall about like the way we live life and move through time, and sort of this idea of an unexplored life, or like the paths you did not take. I loved that element of it a lot. This is a really strange book, and it is one that invites a lot of reflection, which is why I keep thinking about it and why it probably keeps growing in my feelings. It is also one that I would recommend pretty widely, but not in a way where I recommend something that I think that has mass appeal or that lots of people will enjoy. I would recommend this like kind of knowing that probably be like 50-50 split on people who will like it and not, but regardless, I would want to talk to everybody about it, whether they liked it or not, just because I feel like the things you take away from it, the connections you make, and whether those things work or don't work for you and why, like that is fascinating to me in the context of this book. So I'm like, read it, try it, let me know. Overall, I kind of split the difference and gave this 4 out of 5 stars. In May, we read The Selection by Kiera Css. This was a reread for me. When I first joined BookTube, this was pretty big in the community. Like everybody was reading and talking about it, so I did too, and I did not like the first book at all. Yeah, I didn't like it, but it's been getting hyped now. Recently, I think that Kiera Css has a new book that came out, but also it's being optioned by Netflix, so people were talking about it again. Coming out of the Glass Hotel, we wanted something a little bit simpler, and so we were thinking about things that were backlist, that had like a lot of popularity, something that a lot of people could talk about, but also something that like our last 2 brain cells could enjoy, as my friend Nicole says. You know, something a little bit more fun and fluffy, if you will. So this like 2012 YA that is like The Hunger Games meets The Bachelor, like that felt right for us in that moment. I reread it and I still do not enjoy it. This is like almost fascinating to me. This book is fascinating because it is so easily consumable, like it's almost compulsively readable, and I know why. It's because it doesn't have any plot and very little friction at all. The language is very simple. It just is something that you can breeze through very, very easily. And so if your experience of it like kind of stops there, like if you're just like, that was a thing, and you never think about it more, I can see why people will just like continue to binge or like have a generally positive experience. But if you stop and look at any of the pieces, like at least this was my experience, as soon as I stopped to think about this book and the things it did or did not do, like the worse it gets in my feelings and in my estimation, and like the more upset I get that it is just nothing, is such a nothing book. One of the things that I remember about my original read, and one of the things that you hear more often when people are talking badly about this book, is that the main character, America Singer, is unlikable. I kind of had that in the back of my head as I went in because I wanted to pay attention to that. I feel like I've personally learned a lot about what we say or what we're talking about when we talk about unlikable characters, specifically as they pertain to women and young women, and why we often, you know, check some behavior that is allowed in others, and we see it in women characters and immediately like write them off as unlikable. So I was going in prepared to kind of take back what I had said about it earlier, and I don't know, giving it more leeway, but I still didn't like America, and I think that the thing that really bothered me about her was less about her as a character. Some of it was her as a character, but the real thing is that I did not enjoy her as a narrator, and I did not want to be in her head. She is just so unobservant. She didn't know anything that was happening, and she kept asking us, the reader, questions, and I like, I don't know, girl. If you don't know, like, I don't know. And she didn't know anything. She was just absolutely clueless in the context of her own story. And then on top of that, she was just she had like that very classic 2012-ish, like not like other girls vibe, and it manifested in some ways where the way that she talked about, described, and just considered the people around her was really, really annoying, and just like it reflected poorly on her as a character, the way that she completely either dismissed people or like refused to learn their names or was constantly like describing or judging people by their weight, or, you know, if someone was wearing makeup, she immediately like made a comment about that because she didn't need makeup. She was naturally beautiful. So it's just like all of these like little things that get jabbing and jabbing and jabbing at you about her through the narration that like at the end I'm like, okay, I get it. Like this is a legit unlikable character. Outside of that, there was just not a lot going for it. I'm somebody who both enjoys like dystopians and is a sucker for The Bachelor. I love the Hunger Games, like, so this has like the pieces of something that would work for me. Like this is not something that I went into like, this is not for me, like Chain of Gold. Like this is something that should absolutely work for me, but it doesn't, because it doesn't do any of those pieces particularly well. Its dystopian world is not developed at all, and it doesn't actually know what it's trying to say with its dystopian world. Like what is the point of setting this like primarily like dating show thing inside of a dystopian world? I don't know. It throws out the pieces of its world building in these really heavy-handed ways, but it ultimately doesn't do enough to flesh out the world. There are two settings, like her house and then the palace, and you never see anything beyond that to the world itself. It's honestly like the world is like the forest in the background of the palace. So that part of it wasn't well done, but then okay, who cares? Maybe we're just here for the Bachelor vibes, but it doesn't get anything about the Bachelor feels right. Like we don't see enough of the interpersonal drama or like the relationships between the prince and these contestants. And when there are eliminations, which I think there are two, they happen in like sweeps. So like people go and you don't even know who's really going, and they happen sort of off camera at times. So like I'm here for the game, but the game is not entirely happening for me to consume. This is just a small book with small ideas, with a really narrow plot and a thin world, with nothing to say, with no characters that you can really enjoy or root for. Like I honestly, there wasn't anything here for me to say about it in a positive way. I gave this 1 out of 5 stars. Speaking of the Hunger Games, however, and moving on from House Salt, I did do an entire reread of the Hunger Games trilogy by Suzanne Collins, and that was for Snark Squad Pod. We talk about it very generally and very broadly, and in the context of rereading the series in the year of our Lord 2020. So that episode is already out if you'd like to listen to it, but I originally read the Hunger Games, I don't know when. It was at some point pre the movies coming out, but it was before I started using Goodreads or was tracking my reading at all, so I honestly have no way to remember or contextualize. Like I don't remember when I read this, but I read the series once, and then they live so strongly in my feelings, however, I think primarily because of the movies and because of the way that it kind of got bigger inside of pop culture in general. So this was my first time rereading them. I had attempted to reread years before but never got through them, so I was nervous about coming back to the series and what I would find and whether I would enjoy them. And I also was thinking about this in the context of its ending, because this was a book that for a lot of years I talked about Mockingjay as being the like worst ending to a series. Like it was like the example to me, like classic example of like not ending a series well in a trilogy, and I just remember having really strong feelings about it. So I wanted to kind of re-examine that and, you know, open myself up to the possibility that I was wrong about that, and you know, I really was. I understand why I said what I said and why I interpreted that ending as being bad. I think that it affected me emotionally in a really big way. I think it did what it set out to do effectively, which is why, you know, I felt that way, but I interpreted that as like being bad, like as it did a bad thing because it hurt me. But I think that in the end, the reason that it hurt me was because it was like the culmination of the story in a way that it couldn't end any other way. And I know why people criticize it, but I don't know, in reading it this way, I just really saw it as the full completion of her arc. I was more appreciative of the fact that this book ultimately says that even if you suffer trauma and you don't necessarily get over that trauma, there are ways in which you can find happiness. And even if there isn't full justice, there are ways that you can find some justice. But this idea that there is something that can be recovered from really dire, horrible circumstances, like, I don't know, something about that message in 2020, I was like, this is it. There were so many elements of the trilogy that really jumped out to me, and the PTSD and sort of trauma and the way that we see so many characters dealing with their trauma in different ways. I thought that that was really interesting, and you see it all the way from Katniss's mom and the way that we're immediately introduced to her as sort of like a bad mom because she checks out. But when you realize that she is like a victim of her own circumstances as well, she just is dealing with that trauma differently than Katniss did, then you start to see the way that Collins really makes these complex, full characters come to life. And yeah, food really jumped out to me. I know it's called The Hunger Games, but I don't think I ever really paid attention to the way that Collins uses food to tell you so much about her world, from where the food is, you know, planted and gathered, to who has access to it, to what people are eating, to the way that she really describes the capital in lush ways, but all of that is tied to senses and to food, and the way that food plays a role inside of the Hunger Games as well. So every time there was like a mention of food, I was like freaking out about like the additional world building and details that that gave you. I think that people discount this sometimes because it is a very closed first person narrative, and so you are in Katniss's head, and I think it's deceptively simple because you're hearing her tell her story. But that writing, that simplicity just does so much, I think, for the story in general, and it teaches you a lot about this character that you go through the entire journey with. So here's a case where you are actually in somebody's head, and while at times I was like, Katniss, please, like, she's obvious, you're making the wrong decisions, or you're not seeing things the way that they are, or whatever it was. I was frustrated with her, but I didn't hate being in her head. I didn't hate that she was the one telling me the story, like, you know, the selection. It's such an unfair comparison, but I didn't do it. They did it. They said it was The Hunger Games meets The Bachelor, not me. I've thought a lot about sitting down and doing like full discussion videos about each of these books because that's how many feelings I have about it. But it's like, you know, one of those projects that are one day, maybe, we'll see. So speaking of rereading, I've always talked about how much I enjoy rereading just in general. I think it is an extension of just being a soothing activity for me. I love knowing in advance the emotional beats and the plot beats, and like knowing the resolution to things. It's also why I look up spoilers if I'm having a hard time with like managing my anxiety while I'm reading something fictional. So in general, I love rereading for that, but I also love rereading because it helps me explore things, and because obviously I'm somebody who likes to break down things. Have I mentioned that? But like rereading helps me, teaches me how to do that. If I don't pick up on something on the first read, I know I can go back and see what else I can glean from the text, and I just love it. I really love rereading. In the context of not my normal life, but like the worst timeline, rereading has been a lifeline for me. It allows me to read, but enjoy some of those like benefits of being within a fictional story, but not having to worry about what's going to happen. Surprising probably no one, I started a reread of my favorite series, which is the Fairyland series. I got through the first 3 books. I was doing it as a buddy read with Jocelyn from Yogi with a Book, and I had to apologize because I abandoned it. I abandoned that reread. I was basically in the middle of the 3rd book when I got laid off, and I managed to finish it, but my brain kind of like was done with that. You know, the association right now is unfortunately not great. I know I will return to the series, and I loved rereading. I just continue to love the series as a whole. I would love to do an updated video talking about why, but I just need to put some time and space and distance between that last experience and coming back to the story. I also reread The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. I've reread this book 4 times now. I haven't talked about it on my channel, I don't think very recently. Basically, I picked this book up because, you know, it's the Lord of the Rings, and I read the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, but I struggled all the way through it. I did not have a pleasant reading experience. I didn't even rate it on Goodreads. I was like, I don't know, I made it through. That's all I could basically say about it. A couple years later, because I am who I am and I always like to give things another shot or reread things or whatnot, I decided that I would try it again, but this time with the dramatized abridged version of the audiobook. I think in the abridged version, without all of like the extra details in the story, it taught me how to love the plot and the characters, and I was like, oh, like this is the meat of the story that people really enjoy. So immediately after I finished that, I started listening to the unabridged audiobook version. Robert Inglis, I think, is the narrator that I listened to, and I was like, oh, okay, I do like this. So those are the first 3 times that I had read it, and then this time was the 4th time, and I just, you know, now that these characters and the story live in my feelings, like I'm like, yeah, describe that treat to me, man. I love it. I also really enjoy the part of the like soothing, lovely nature of rereading is kind of, like I said, knowing those beats and emotional beats and like looking forward to it. And I find that that's particularly pronounced in road trip kinds of books and those sorts of adventures. It's also why I wanted to read the Fairyland series. But I don't know, there's something about going physically from location to location and like knowing that those things are coming up that soothe my soul. I don't know if that makes sense, but I loved going through that with the hobbits again, and like thinking, oh, they're gonna meet Tom Bombadil next, and they're gonna be at the inn next, or you know, whatever it was. Just kind of looking forward to those specific physical locations was great. And of course I read this and then I started watching the movie. Did I move on with the series at all? No, not at all. Not the movies or the books, but I had a great time reading The Fellowship of the Ring. I also reread a book in a series that I keep telling myself that I'm going to finish because I love it, but I never finish because I keep just rereading the first book, and that is The Parasol Protectorate by Gail Carriger. I've talked about this book on my channel before, obviously, because I've read it a ton, but I just love Alexia Terabody as a main character, and this is like, it has like a mystery component to it, and it is a paranormal romance sort of thing, but it's just something that every time I read it, like I don't get tired of like the mystery aspect of it, and like kind of going through the danger and the trouble with Alexia. It helps, it has a lot of humor and a lot of sass, so that rereading it, like I'm always tickled by the circumstances, by the humor, by the banter between the 2 main characters. I really enjoy this. It's very tongue-in-cheek. I love the way that it kind of takes on the trope of paranormal romance in a very like loving manner, and some things it kind of pokes at, and some things it subverts, and some things it does like just sort of exaggerated in a way that is like, yes, you know, it kind of takes ownership over these tropes that you would expect from a paranormal romance, and then it puts at the head of it this really competent, sassy main character that I, as I said, love to bits and pieces. After that, I kind of kept on with the paranormal romances, and I reread Moon Called and Bloodbound, the first 2 books in the Mercy Thompson series by Patricia Briggs. The last time I read these books, I was in a similar circumstance. That it was at the end of last year, actually, when things got really crazy at work at the end of the year, and I just sort of binged them, and my thoughts were like, that was like serviceable. So it started to bother me after the second book that I was reading and not really processing, because I thought I was enjoying it. So I put it aside with the thought that I would come back when I could spare more time to really look at the series and decide if I enjoyed it. So I actually moved on and I read the 3rd book, Iron Kissed, and I am now in like the same situation where I'm like, dang it, do I like this? Is it doing it well? I don't know. I haven't decided, and I think that the new problem is that this is a spoiler, I guess, but it's more of a content warning, I would say, that the main character gets raped in the 3rd book, and it is one of the hardest and most gruesome rape scenes that I've ever experienced in fiction. It literally, it just absolutely broke my heart. It was horrible to read, but it was supposed to be, and so now I'm in this position where I'm not sure what this author is going to do. Whenever you have your main character get raped in fiction, like, I'm not saying that that can't happen, it happens to lots and lots of women, but then it always is that thing of like, okay, how are you going to treat this? How are you going to handle this? How are you going to do it justice for the sake of your main character that now has to live with this and carry this? And so the 3rd book kind of ends on that, and in order to know how she treats it, I have to move on to the 4th book, but that literally gutted me. Like, I don't want to read more, but I have to if I want to know how it gets treated. And so that's kind of where I am now. I'm absolutely fascinated by paranormal stories, by werewolves and vampires specifically, because of the built-in power dynamics with it. It's something that I like to explore, and it's something that I don't think gets done very well at all. But I keep reading about it because I'm like, okay, how are you gonna do it? And I love kind of seeing the pieces of it. I think that something that the Patricia Briggs does in the Mercy Thompson series to kind of to balance that off is also make Mercy supernatural. She is, obviously there's like a pecking order and a hierarchy, but by making her supernatural and also sort of outside of that hierarchy, she removes some of that power imbalance and makes it a more even playing field, which I really appreciated. I wouldn't say that Briggs completely subverts any of these tropes, but I really appreciated that she did play with that power dynamic, and she made Mercy a really independent character. So I enjoyed all of those pieces. That's what I gleaned from my reread of the first two. I was like, okay, I do like this, and here's why. Then I got to the third book and I'm like, oh no, do I like this? If I ever figure it out, I'll let you guys know. That is pretty much it for me today. I did read one other book, but I'm gonna do a standalone review for that book. And there's a bunch of books, like I said, that I started that I'm currently in the middle of or whatnot. But yeah, we'll see. Well, as I said, we are doing our best. I would love to hear down in the comments if this whole isolation pandemic thing has affected your reading. Kind of outside of that, I've also been binging TV shows, and I found myself really attracted to procedurals. I watched one season of Criminal Minds. I watched a season of Eureka. I watched a season of iZombie, and I watched like 3 seasons of Bones. And then at that point, the murder of George Floyd happened, and things really started to take off with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I found that, like, I would log on to my streaming services and they're like, hey, want to watch more propaganda? And I was like, dang it. And you know, it wasn't the soothing piece of media that it used to be anymore. So I'm kind of in between things that I've been watching. But the general idea of like reading mysteries and the sort of things where like the bad guy gets caught at the end is really appealing to my brain right now. So what is appealing to your brain right now? Has your reading changed, or are you just kind of reading as normal? Yeah, don't rub it in, but just let me know. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon.